The first thing I noticed was the sound, not the speeches, not the laughter, not the bragging, the soft clink of champagne flutes. It floated across my parents' backyard every few seconds, mixing with the smell of expensive appetizers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Servers in black uniforms moved between clusters of investors, carrying silver trays loaded with smoked salmon crostini, miniature crab cakes, and tiny desserts nobody actually ate. My father, Gideon Kensington, loved events like this. He called it a networking reception. Everyone else called it an excuse to show off. The Kensington estate sat on almost 4 acres outside McLean, Virginia. The lawn looked like it belonged to a country club. The landscaping crew had spent 3 days preparing for the party. I knew because I had accidentally seen one of the invoices sitting on my father's desk earlier that week. $12,483.71. For grass. Priorities. I stood near the far edge of the patio, holding a glass of sparkling water, while people in designer suits congratulated my brother on becoming the latest tech genius destined to change the world. According to Trenton, his new startup would revolutionize predictive consumer analytics. According to the investors, it would make them rich. According to me, it was another software company with a longer PowerPoint presentation than actual revenue. But nobody had asked for my opinion. That was normal. At family gatherings, I existed mostly as decorative background furniture. My brother was the attraction. I was the folding chair. Trenton stood in the center of the crowd, wearing a navy suit that probably cost around $4,000. He laughed loudly. He shook hands aggressively. He repeated the same story about securing venture funding at least 6 times. Each version somehow made him sound more impressive than the last. Meanwhile, I was trying to finish a glass of sparkling water without being recruited into another conversation about cryptocurrency. That was when my mother arrived with a group of investors. Valerie Kensington could spot wealthy people the way bloodhounds tracked scents. She guided them across the patio with a polished smile and perfectly rehearsed charm. "And this," she announced proudly, placing a hand on Trenton's shoulder, "is our son, the founder behind all of this." The investors immediately leaned closer. Questions followed: funding rounds, growth projections, market expansion, future acquisitions. My brother soaked it up like a plant finally getting watered. Then one of the investors noticed me. A gray-haired man wearing a watch worth more than my car glanced in my direction. "And who's this?" he asked. For a split second, my mother looked surprised. I was still standing there. Then she laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not an angry laugh. The polished kind, the dangerous kind. The kind that lets everyone know exactly where you rank without ever raising its voice. "Oh, Blythe," she said. "She's just a desk clerk over at the Defense Department." Several people nodded politely. My mother continued, "You know, filing paperwork, scheduling things, answering phones." A few investors smiled. Someone chuckled. My mother waved her hand dismissively. "Somebody has to do the boring work." The group laughed, not because it was funny, because wealthy people often mistake social survival for humor. I smiled politely. Years of practice made it easy. The trick wasn't controlling your expression. The trick was accepting that correcting people usually accomplished nothing, especially when they had already decided who you were. An investor looked at me sympathetically. That was somehow worse. "So you're in administration?" he asked. "Something like that," I replied. "Technically true." Technically, the conversation immediately shifted back to Trenton. Again, I took another sip of sparkling water. The bubbles tasted flat. Across the lawn, my father was explaining leadership principles to a venture capitalist who had sold his company 3 times. Nobody seemed bothered by the irony. My right hand remained buried inside my coat pocket. Most people assumed it was because the evening air felt cool. It wasn't. My thumb rested against a government-issued encrypted communication device roughly the size of a smartphone but nearly twice as heavy. The casing was reinforced. The operating system wasn't available to civilians, and it had been vibrating every 5 minutes for almost half an hour. Short pulse, pause, short pulse, pause. The pattern repeated again. I felt it against my palm. I didn't remove the device. Not yet. The signal wasn't urgent enough. At least not yet. I kept my expression neutral. A server passed carrying champagne. I declined. Another investor approached my mother. Trenton launched into another speech about innovation. The device vibrated again. Short pulse, pause, short pulse. I checked the time on a nearby outdoor clock, 7:18 p.m., 5 minutes since the last alert. Interesting, not good. Interesting. People think military operations are all explosions and action movies. Most of the time they're schedules, timelines, fuel calculations, communication windows, weather reports, transportation routes, tiny decisions made by people sitting thousands of miles away, people at desks. Funny how that works. The device vibrated again, this time slightly longer. My attention sharpened immediately. Around me, the party continued. Laughter, business cards, fake compliments, future deals. The entire evening felt sealed inside a perfect porcelain shell where appearance mattered more than reality. Nobody here knew what I actually did. Nobody here knew why the government occasionally called at impossible hours. Nobody here knew why I never fully unpacked a suitcase. And honestly, most of them wouldn't care. They only understood titles that fit neatly on business cards. I glanced toward the darkening horizon. Far beyond the estate, a low rumble rolled through the distance. Most guests ignored it. Just weather, just another storm somewhere far away. My thumb remained pressed against the encrypted device as another faint vibration traveled through the casing. Short pulse. Pause. The distant rumble answered it almost perfectly, a strange rhythm. One coming from the sky, one coming from my pocket, both getting closer. Have you ever been treated like the least important person in the room, only to know you were carrying responsibilities nobody else there could even imagine? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, hidden truths, and people who earn respect the hard way, make sure you're part of our community. New stories premiere every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Join us for the next one. The vibration came again, stronger this time, and I finally realized my evening was about to become everyone else's problem. I shifted my weight slightly and kept my hand in my pocket. The vibration stopped. That bothered me more than the alerts themselves. Constant updates meant the system was functioning normally. Silence usually meant people were making decisions faster than reports could be written. Across the lawn, another round of applause broke out as Trenton finished explaining how his company planned to redefine data-driven consumer behavior. One investor actually called him visionary. I nearly choked on my sparkling water. 3 months earlier, Trenton had called me asking how to recover a password he had forgotten for his own cloud storage account. Visionary. Sure. The crowd began drifting toward the buffet tables as servers refreshed trays and replaced empty champagne bottles. I was considering whether I could quietly disappear for 30 seconds and check my device when a familiar voice stopped that idea immediately. Blythe. I looked up. Trenton was smiling. That was never a good sign. People who didn't know him thought his smile looked charming. People who grew up with him knew better. Behind him stood 3 investors and a venture capital partner whose face had appeared on at least 2 business magazines during the previous year. Trenton casually placed an arm around one investor's shoulder. You know what's funny? He said. Nobody had asked. He continued anyway. My sister works in logistics. The investors nodded politely. I remained silent. Trenton pointed toward the buffet. We're running low on ice. I already knew where this was going. You're good at logistics, right? A few people laughed. Trenton snapped his fingers, at me. Go make yourself useful. The group chuckled. One investor looked uncomfortable. The others pretended not to notice. That was usually how these moments worked. Nobody wanted to be the person who challenged the golden child during his victory party. I stared at him for a moment. Not because I was angry. Because I was genuinely curious whether a 36-year-old man understood how ridiculous he looked. Apparently not. Trenton grinned wider. Kitchen's inside. Then my father joined the conversation. Perfect timing. Gideon stepped beside Trenton and immediately sized up the situation. Instead of correcting him, he nodded approvingly. Your brother's hosting an important event. There it was. The family motto. Not officially, but yes, no. Support Trenton. Always. My father pointed toward the house. Help him out. 3 short sentences. 1 short command. Story of my childhood. I glanced at the investors. One avoided eye contact. Another suddenly became fascinated by a tray of shrimp. The third looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Smart man. I gave a small nod. Sure. Trenton smirked. Victory achieved. He turned back toward his audience and immediately resumed talking about leadership. The man had just delegated ice cubes. I walked away before my sarcasm got me into trouble. The noise from the party faded with every step toward the house. Laughter became background noise. Music became a faint echo. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, the difference felt almost shocking. Silence. Actual silence. No investors. No speeches. No performance. Just stainless steel appliances, polished countertops, and the low hum of an expensive refrigerator. For the first time all evening, I could think. I set my glass down beside a catering invoice. The total read $18,746.22. For one night again. Priorities. Then I pulled the device from my pocket. The screen activated immediately. Black background, government encryption interface. No notifications, no messages, just a flashing red banner. My stomach tightened, not from fear, from recognition. I had seen that alert before, only twice. Neither situation had ended well. The message occupied nearly the entire display. Critical, extraction compromised, coordinator immediately. As a secure timestamp appeared underneath. 1923-17, current, live, not a drill, not preparation, not planning. Something was already happening. I tapped the authentication field. The device scanned my fingerprint. Another screen opened. A classified operations dashboard appeared. Several information fields remained intentionally hidden behind security restrictions, even on my clearance level. But I could see enough. Satellite support unstable, communications degraded, hostile territory, Tier 1 extraction team, multiple operators on ground. My jaw tightened. People often hear the word logistics and imagine spreadsheets, shipping labels, inventory reports. Maybe somebody ordering office supplies. I used to let people believe that. It made life easier. The truth was much less boring. When extraction teams became trapped, when aircraft needed rerouting, when surveillance assets failed, when operators found themselves surrounded thousands of miles from home, my desk became the center of everything. Not because I was important, because information was. The right route could save lives. The wrong decision could send notifications to families. I stared at the screen. Updates continued arriving every few seconds. Priority markers, status changes, signal degradation reports. Someone needed coordination immediately. Outside, another burst of laughter drifted through the glass doors. I almost laughed myself. The contrast felt absurd. A room full of people celebrating projected profits. A screen showing a crisis unfolding in real time. Two completely different worlds separated by 20 feet. The device flashed again, brighter this time. The red warning reflected across the polished granite countertop, then across the dark kitchen window. For a brief moment, the reflection looked almost identical to another blinking red light far beyond the estate. I glanced outside. High above the distant horizon, a red aviation beacon pulsed against the night sky. Slow, steady, moving closer than it should have been. I slipped the device back into my coat and headed toward the front hallway. Every instinct I had was telling me the same thing. Move, now. The dashboard updates were getting worse, not better. Communications instability rarely fixed itself. Every minute lost created new problems somewhere else. Every delay forced someone in the field to improvise. And improvisation was expensive. Sometimes the bill came in blood. I crossed the kitchen, passed through the dining room, and reached the front foyer. The massive oak door was less than 10 feet away. I was already calculating the fastest route to Joint Base Andrews. The secure transport team would likely be waiting. A fleet package would already be assembling. The moment I cleared the property, I could start working. I reached for the door handle. Blithe. My hand stopped, of course. I turned slowly. My mother stood at the opposite end of the hallway holding a champagne flute. She wasn't smiling. That meant trouble. Valerie Kensington had many talents. Finding the exact moment to make something harder was one of them. "Where are you going?" she asked. I kept my voice calm. "I need to leave." Her eyes narrowed immediately. "Leave?" She glanced toward the patio. "The toast starts in 10 minutes. I said nothing, she continued. "The photographer is setting up." Still nothing. Then her expression changed, not concern, annoyance. The kind people feel when a table reservation gets canceled. We talked about this. Actually, we hadn't. But facts rarely slowed my mother down. The family photo is important. I looked at the front door again, then back at her. "I have to go." The words sounded simple, because they were. Unfortunately, simple truths were never enough for my family. My mother stepped closer. "No, just one word. Firm, final, ridiculous." I checked my watch. 7:29 p.m. The operation alert had arrived 6 minutes earlier. That may not sound important. But 6 minutes could mean an aircraft crossing a fuel threshold. 6 minutes could mean losing visual confirmation. 6 minutes could mean an extraction window closing. People who lived normal lives rarely understood how quickly situations changed. My mother certainly didn't. Blythe. Her voice softened slightly. The performance version. The one she used when wealthy guests were nearby. Your brother worked very hard for tonight. There it was again. Everything eventually returned to Trenton, his achievements, his opportunities, his image, his future. I had spent most of my life orbiting around those priorities, like furniture being rearranged whenever guests arrived. I took a slow breath. Mom, I have a federal emergency. That finally got her attention, for about half a second. Then she laughed, actually laughed. Not loudly, just enough. A federal emergency? She rolled her eyes. I could almost predict the next sentence before she said it. What happened? A small smirk appeared. They run out of printer toner? The joke amused her far more than it amused me. I remained silent. My mother took my silence as confirmation. Big mistake. Don't be dramatic, Blythe. She moved directly between me and the front door. You are staying. Outside, applause erupted somewhere near the patio. The photographer was probably gathering people. The timing couldn't have been worse, or more revealing. I stared at my mother, not angrily, not even disappointed. Just aware, really aware. Sometimes people reveal exactly who they are when two priorities collide. For my mother, the choice wasn't difficult. On one side stood an urgent responsibility she didn't understand. On the other stood a family photograph. The photograph won. Not because she was cruel, because appearances had always mattered more to her than reality. The realization landed harder than I expected. Growing up, I spent years trying to earn approval. Better grades, more discipline, more accomplishments, more patience. Eventually, I joined the military. Then intelligence support. Then special operations coordination. Every promotion felt important. Every evaluation mattered. Every mission expanded my responsibilities. None of it changed anything here. Because my family wasn't evaluating who I actually was. They were evaluating the version of me that existed in their heads. The quiet daughter, the boring daughter, the daughter with the desk's job, the daughter who wasn't Trenton. The device vibrated again inside my coat. Longer this time. My stomach tightened. The alert wasn't waiting politely anymore. Somewhere far away, operators were depending on information they didn't yet have. I knew exactly what kind of people they were, not because I had read personnel files, because I had worked with them for years. Men who missed birthdays, missed anniversaries, missed holidays. Men who climbed onto aircraft knowing there were no guarantees. Men who trusted strangers to make good decisions from thousands of miles away. Men who joked about terrible coffee and argued about football teams while preparing for missions most people would never hear about. People called them operators. I called many of them friends. Some felt like brothers. And right now they were waiting, not for luck, not for heroics, for coordinates, for routing, for information, for someone to do their job. My mother folded her arms. The conversation in her mind was over. Honestly, Blythe, I don't know why you're making this difficult. I almost smiled. Not because anything was funny. Because the sentence perfectly summarized my role in the family. Whenever I disagreed, I became difficult. Whenever I had priorities, I became selfish. Whenever I refused to play my assigned role, I became the problem. Outside, I could hear Trenton beginning another speech. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. The photographer called for people to gather. A celebration was forming. A crisis was unfolding, and somehow I was trapped between them. The device vibrated once more. This time it didn't feel like a notification. It felt like a countdown. I felt my mother's hand close around my wrist before I could make another move. Not painfully, just firmly enough to remind me that in her mind the discussions had already been settled. "Come on," she said. The words sounded pleasant. The grip didn't. She guided me back toward the patio while I checked the time again. 7:31 p.m. The device in my pocket remained silent for nearly 30 seconds. That worried me more than the vibrations. Somewhere, people were adapting to a situation that was getting worse. Meanwhile, I was being escorted to a family photo. The contrast would have been funny if it weren't so absurd. As we stepped outside, the party had reached its next phase. Guests were gathering near the center of the lawn. Champagne glasses sparkled under decorative lighting. Investors stood shoulder to shoulder with local politicians, executives, and people who introduced themselves using their net worth. The photographer was adjusting equipment near a flower arrangement that probably cost more than my first apartment. My mother released my wrist and immediately fixed my collar. Appearance first. Always. "There," she said. "Perfect." I wasn't sure whether she was talking to me or the crowd. Across the patio, Trenton picked up a champagne flute and tapped it gently with a spoon. The ringing sound spread through the gathering. Conversations slowed. People turned. Smiles appeared. The audience assembled. Trenton loved audiences. The man would have delivered keynote speeches to squirrels if enough of them showed up. He raised his glass. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Polite applause followed. He launched into a carefully rehearsed speech about innovation, ambition, entrepreneurship, leadership, growth, and every other business buzzword that sounded impressive on LinkedIn. The investors nodded. My father looked proud. My mother looked emotional. I looked at the horizon. The blinking red light I'd seen earlier appeared again in the distance. "Closer now, much closer," Trenton continued. "I've always believed success comes down to choices. Of course it does. Successful people love explaining success after they've already achieved it. It makes everything sound simple." He walked slowly through the crowd. "I've always believed people decide who they become." More nodding, more smiles. The speech was working. Then I noticed him glance toward me. That familiar expression returned. The one he wore whenever he saw an opportunity to make himself look bigger. By making someone else look smaller. I knew exactly where this was heading. Unfortunately, so did he. Trenton pointed towards several investors. "Look around tonight," he smiled. "These are people who took risks." More applause. Then his gaze landed directly on me, and not everybody chooses that path. A few guests turned in my direction. The temperature around me seemed to drop several degrees, not physically, socially. Trenton laughed lightly. "You know, growing up, my sister and I had access to the same opportunities." There it was, the setup. Some guests smiled politely. Others looked uncomfortable. Nobody interrupted. Nobody ever did. Trenton spread his hands dramatically. "I chased big goals." He pointed at himself. "I built companies." Then he pointed at me, and Blythe chose stability. A few chuckles appeared, not loud. "Not yet." He kept going. The confidence in his voice grew stronger with every sentence. "Now, there's nothing wrong with that." The audience laughed immediately, because everyone knew exactly what that phrase meant. There is absolutely something wrong with that. At least according to the speaker. Trenton shook his head. "Not everyone wants to change the world." More laughter. My father grinned. My mother smiled proudly. The investors watched like they were attending a comedy show. Then came the punchline. The one he'd probably rehearsed beforehand. "Some of us build the future." He paused. Perfect timing. "Some of us just order the office supplies." The crowd erupted. Not everyone, but enough. Enough for the laughter to spread. Enough for the humiliation to become public. Enough for my parents to hear it. My father actually laughed, a full laugh. Not polite, not forced, genuine. That part surprised me more than it should have. I stood perfectly still. No reaction, no anger, no defense, no speech, because arguing would only give them another performance. And because something else had already captured my attention. The wind. At first it was subtle. A few napkins shifted across a nearby table. Then several decorative candles flickered simultaneously. Guests began adjusting loose jackets and dresses. Trenton kept talking. Still smiling, still enjoying himself, still completely unaware. The wind strengthened. The oak trees along the edge of the estate began moving. Not swaying gently. Moving, branches bent. Leaves whipped violently through the air. Several guests turned toward the sound. My attention shifted toward the horizon again. The blinking red light was no longer distant. It was approaching. Fast. Very fast. The device inside my pocket vibrated. Hard, long, urgent. I didn't need to check the screen. I already knew. The operation had escalated. The timing wasn't coincidence. Nearby, a crystal champagne glass tipped over and shattered against the patio stones. The photographer grabbed his equipment. A server struggled to keep hold of an empty tray. The wind became stronger still. Several women grabbed their hair. Guests started looking around nervously. "What the hell is that?" someone asked. Trenton finally stopped talking. For the first time all evening, he looked confused. Then we heard it. Not thunder, not weather, something mechanical, something massive. A deep rhythmic pounding rolled across the estate. Whump, whump, whump. The sound grew louder with terrifying speed. Crystal glasses rattled. Tablecloths snapped violently. The flower arrangements began tipping over. Conversations vanished instantly. Every head turned toward the night sky. Trenton's smudged laughter disappeared beneath a deafening wall of sound as the entire backyard started to shake. Several guests instinctively ducked as the sound slammed across the estate. Whomp! 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 The air itself seemed to vibrate. Tablecloths lifted off catering tables and sailed across the lawn like giant white kites. Decorative napkins exploded into the air. Empty champagne flutes rolled across stone pathways before shattering against garden walls. Within seconds, the elegant networking reception transformed into pure chaos. Women grabbed their hair with both hands. Men shielded their faces from flying debris. One investor lost control of his expensive hat and watched it disappear into the darkness. A catering tent near the western edge of the property folded inward with a loud snap. Then another one followed. The downwash was brutal. This wasn't a sightseeing helicopter. This wasn't a news crew. This was military. And military aircraft didn't care how much money had been spent on landscaping. A server stumbled while trying to save a tray of desserts. 3 dozen miniature cheesecakes launched into the air and landed in a hedge. Honestly, it was one of the more satisfying things I'd seen all evening. Guests scattered in every direction. Some ran toward the house. Others crouched behind tables. Several simply stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. My father chose outrage, naturally. "What is this?" Gideon's voice cracked through the noise. His face had turned bright red. "Who the hell is flying that thing?" The helicopter continued approaching. "Whomp! Whomp! Whomp!" My father pointed toward the sky like an angry homeowner confronting a raccoon. "This is a residential area." Nobody answered him, mostly because nobody could hear him. But that didn't stop him. "You can't fly that low." He looked around for someone to blame. The universe failed to provide a volunteer. Meanwhile, Trenton was having his own meltdown. My event. He stared in horror at the destruction unfolding around him. The flower arrangements, the tents, the carefully planned presentation. Months of preparation were being erased by rotor wash. His hand dove into his pocket. A second later, he was holding his phone. "I'm calling the police." He yelled it so loudly that several nearby guests turned toward him. "I'm serious." He pointed dramatically toward the approaching aircraft. "This is insane." Another gust blasted across the property. Several patio chairs flipped into the pool. Trenton nearly lost his footing. "I'll sue them." Nobody responded, mostly because people were busy trying not to get hit by flying furniture. "I'll sue whoever owns that helicopter." That statement alone told me exactly how little he understood the situation. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. The aircraft finally broke over the tree line. Several guests gasped, others simply stared. The helicopter wasn't painted with bright rescue markings. There were no television station logos, no registration numbers visible from this distance, no corporate branding, nothing, just matte black, dark enough to disappear against the night sky, powerful enough to dominate everything beneath it. My pulse remained steady, not because I was fearless, because I recognized it. The moment I saw the silhouette, I knew, MH-60M, Special Operations Variant, low visibility configuration. The kind of aircraft that didn't appear unless something important had already gone wrong. A strange calm settled over me, the noise, the panic, the shouting. All of it faded into the background. For the first time all evening, everything actually made sense. The alerts, the escalating messages, the emergency activation, the timing. This wasn't a disruption. This was transportation, my transportation. The realization landed with surprising simplicity. Somewhere in the world, a situation had deteriorated beyond remote management. That meant I was needed in person, immediately. The device vibrated again. I didn't bother checking it. The helicopter itself was the update. Nearby, guests continued running for cover. One woman crouched behind a decorative fountain. Another clung to her husband as if the aircraft might personally attack them. An investor dropped his phone while trying to record video. The expression on his face suggested he had never experienced a genuine emergency before. Lucky man. I took one step forward, then another. The crowd was moving away from the aircraft. I was moving toward it. My mother noticed first. "Blythe," she struggled against the wind. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer. Not because I was being dramatic, because I was focused. Years of training create habits. When operations become active, priorities simplify themselves. Ignore distractions. Gather information. Move toward the objective. Everything else waits. My posture changed before I even realized it. The careful family version of me disappeared. The quiet daughter, the ignored sister, the woman standing politely near the edge of the party. All of that belonged to a different environment, a different mission, a different life. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, started assessing landing conditions, distance, wind direction, obstacle clearance, potential hazards. The lawn was large enough. The pilot clearly knew it too. The aircraft adjusted position slightly. Professional, precise, deliberate. A nearby oak tree bent violently beneath the rotor wash. Several branches snapped free and tumbled across the grass. Guests screamed again. The helicopter descended lower. Much lower. Its landing lights remained off. The matte black fuselage reflected almost nothing. To everyone else, it probably looked terrifying. To me, it looked familiar, comfortingly familiar, like seeing an ambulance outside a hospital. Not because something was wrong, because help had arrived. My father finally noticed the direction I was walking. Blithe, his voice carried genuine confusion now. "Get back here," I kept moving. The distance between us felt larger than the lawn itself. Trenton stared at me as though I'd lost my mind. The phone was still clutched in his hand. His expensive suit was covered with dirt and grass clippings. For once, he had absolutely nothing clever to say. The helicopter descended lower still. The rhythmic thunder became overwhelming. Every window in the house rattled. Every remaining champagne glass trembled. Every conversation had stopped. And as the aircraft settled toward the center of the estate, one impossible thought began spreading through the crowd. What if it wasn't here by accident? The answer arrived a few seconds later. The helicopter settled directly into the center of my father's prized garden. Not near it. Not beside it. Directly into it. The landing skids touched down with enough force to flatten a section of imported hedges that Gideon had spent years obsessing over. Decorative shrubs disappeared beneath the aircraft. Flower beds were obliterated instantly. Patio furniture skidded across the lawn before several chairs launched straight into the swimming pool. Thousands of dollars vanished in seconds, maybe more. For the first time in my life, I saw my father completely speechless. The rotor wash continued pounding across the estate. Guests shielded their faces. Napkins and brochures spun through the air. A decorative centerpiece smashed to a stone pathway. Nobody cared anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the helicopter. The engines continued roaring. The massive black aircraft sat in the middle of the property like something from another world. A world far removed from startup valuations and networking events. A world that didn't care about social status. A world that cared about results. The side door slid open. Silence followed, not literal silence. The engines were still deafening, but socially, emotionally, psychologically silence. 4 operators stepped onto the lawn. Every one of them moved with calm precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no need to impress anyone. They wore combat gear most civilians would never recognize. Their weapons remained pointed safely downward, but that didn't make them less intimidating. If anything, it made them more intimidating. Professionals rarely needed to act dangerous. The wealthy guests froze. Several instinctively stepped backward. One investor nearly tripped over a garden lantern. Another looked like he was reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this party. My mother stared at the operators with wide eyes. The color had drained from her face. Trenton looked even worse. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. For once, the man who always had something to say had absolutely nothing. Then another figure emerged from the aircraft, and everything changed. Even from a distance, I recognized him immediately. General Wyatt Caldwell, 4-star general. Commander of Joint Special Operations Task Forces. A man whose decisions affected missions across multiple continents. A man who answered to very few people. A man who had absolutely no interest in impressing investors. He stepped onto the lawn without looking around, without hesitation, without curiosity. Because unlike everyone else here, he already knew why he had arrived. The crowd parted automatically. Not because anyone told them to. Because authority has a way of creating space around itself. General Caldwell walked forward. Straight through the destroyed garden. Straight through the terrified guests, straight through the center of the ruined celebration. My brother noticed him first. Hope flashed across Trenton's face. A dangerous hope, the kind born from misunderstanding. He stepped forward quickly. Finally finding his voice. "Sir!" He pointed at the helicopter, at the garden, at the chaos. "I don't know what's going on, but this property is private." General Caldwell walked right past him. Didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge him, didn't even glance in his direction. The dismissals hit harder than any insult. Trenton simply stood there. Frozen. My father tried next. Gideon stepped forward. No response, nothing, not even eye contact. The general continued walking, past my father, past my mother, past every investor, past every guest, past every person who had spent the evening deciding who mattered. And then he stopped in front of me. The contrast was impossible to miss. 30 minutes earlier, I had been the family jokes. The boring daughter, the office supply clerk, the woman ordering toner cartridges. Now one of the most powerful military leaders in the country was standing directly in front of me while everyone else watched. The rotor wash tugged at my coat. Dust swirled around us. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. General Caldwell gave a short nod. Professional, respectful, direct, the way he always did. Not because I was special, because the mission was. He handed me a rugged tactical tablet. The display was already active. Satellite maps, signal degradation warnings, operational overlays. The situation had deteriorated further. Not good. The general's voice remained calm. Commander. The word hit the crowd like a physical impact. Several people visibly flinched. My mother's eyes widened. Trenton looked genuinely confused. My father looked like someone had just rewritten reality in front of him. General Caldwell continued. We lost satellite uplink over the target zone. I accepted the tablet, already reviewing the data. Already working, already shifting mentally into mission mode. The general pointed toward a flashing section of the map. The extraction team is blind. More updates appeared across the screen. Communications interruptions, terrain complications, asset repositioning, everything happening at once. Exactly the kind of problem I handled. Exactly the reason they came. The general's next sentence removed any remaining doubt. We need you in the sky. His eyes locked onto mine. Right now. I immediately began scrolling through the operational feed, calculating, prioritizing, identifying solutions. Crowds appeared from my awareness. Not intentionally, just naturally. The mission came first, always. But around me, shock continued spreading through the estate. Because for the first time all evening, everyone was seeing the same thing. Not the version of Blythe Kensington they had invented, the real one. And judging by the expressions on their faces, they had no idea what to do with her. The tablet felt familiar in my hands. The faces around me didn't. I was already scanning the operational data when I noticed something unusual. Silence. Not from the helicopter. The engines were still hammering the night air. The silence was coming from my family. Nobody knew what to say. For years, they had built an entire story around who they thought I was. Now that story was collapsing in real time. And nobody had prepared for that. General Caldwell stood beside me, waiting for my assessment. The operators remained near the aircraft, maintaining security without drawing attention to themselves. They looked relaxed. People who were actually dangerous usually did. I enlarged a section of the map. Several satellite feeds had dropped. Signal coverage gaps were expanding. The extraction team had moved farther than expected. Not ideal, fixable, but not ideal. Behind me, I heard someone finally find their voice. Commander? Trenton, of course. The word sounded strange coming from him, like he was trying on a language he didn't understand. I looked up. My brother was staring at me. Not with anger, not with arrogance. Confusion, pure confusion. The kind that appears when reality refuses to cooperate. He pointed vaguely toward me, then toward the helicopter, then toward General Caldwell. Nothing connected inside his head. Wait, his voice cracked. He swallowed. She works at a desk. Nobody laughed. That might have been the biggest change of the evening. Usually, somebody laughed when Trenton spoke. Now nobody did. Because nobody knew what was happening anymore. My mother looked worse. Valerie's jaw was practically hanging open. The polished social confidence she carried all evening had vanished. No charming smile, no clever comment, no elegant recovery. Just shock, raw and unmistakable. My father wasn't doing much better. Gideon stood motionless near the destroyed garden. A few pieces of hedge were still stuck to his pant leg. Normally I might have found that funny. Tonight I mostly found it symbolic. He had spent years evaluating people based on titles, appearances, and assumptions. Now those assumptions were lying in pieces around the lawn, a lot like his landscaping. General Caldwell glanced at me. Status? I looked back down at the tablet. Satellite coverage is degrading across Sector 3. He nodded. That's our assessment. Drone relay still active? For now. I tapped several controls. Good. We can rebuild situational awareness through alternate routing. The general gave a short nod. That was enough. No lengthy discussion, no explanation. Professionals rarely needed speeches. They needed solutions. While we talked, my family continued staring. And suddenly I understood something. The helicopter wasn't what shocked them. The general wasn't what shocked them. The rank wasn't what shocked them. The truth shocked them. Because the truth had been standing beside them for years. They simply never bothered looking. My mother had never asked what I actually did. My father had never cared. Trenton had decided long ago that he already knew. They saw office clothes, quiet behavior, a government badge, then filled in the rest themselves. People do that all the time, not just families, everyone. They mistake visibility for value. If they can't see the weight someone carries, they assume there isn't any. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, people I considered brothers were depending on information flowing through systems I coordinated every day. The irony almost made me smile. My brothers spent years talking about changing the world. I spent years helping keep pieces of it from falling apart. One job generated applause, the other generated responsibility. The engines continued roaring, wind pushed across the lawn, guests remained frozen. Nobody was networking anymore. Nobody cared about investment opportunities. Nobody was asking for business cards. The entire party had become a classroom nobody wanted to attend. Trenton took another step forward, still trying to understand. You mean, he pointed toward the helicopter. They came here, he couldn't even finish the sentence, because saying it out loud would make it real. General Caldwell finally looked at him, not with hostility, not with interest, just briefly. Then his attention returned to me. That tiny moment seemed to hit my brother harder than any insult. He wasn't important here, he wasn't even relevant. The mission was. I looked at my mother, then my father, then my brother. Not angrily. Honestly, the anger had disappeared a long time ago. What remained felt quieter than that. Clarity. I suddenly saw all three of them exactly as they were. People so focused on appearances that they had missed the person standing in front of them. People who confused recognition with understanding. People who believed worth had to be announced before it existed. For a moment, nobody moved. The realization spread across their faces slowly, painfully. The woman they mocked for ordering office supplies. The woman they treated like an afterthought. The woman they joked about in front of investors. She was the person the Pentagon dispatched a stealth helicopter for when lives were on the line. Not because she was famous. Not because she was rich. Because she was needed. Trenton stared at me, still searching for an explanation that fit his version of reality. I decided to help him, just a little. My voice carried clearly despite the engines. Calm. Simple. No speech, no revenge, no drama, just the truth. A desk is just where I sit, Trenton. I watched the words land. Then I gave him the part he would remember for the rest of his life. The world is what I hold together. Nobody spoke. Not my father, not my mother, not my brother, not a single guest. Because some truths don't arrive through arguments. They arrive all at once. And once they do, nothing looks the same anymore. General Caldwell checked his watch. The mission clock was still moving, so was I. I shifted the tablet under my arm and started walking. Not away from an argument. Away from an illusion. The mission was moving forward, so was I. General Caldwell turned without another word and headed back toward the helicopter. The operators immediately adjusted position around us, not because I needed protection from my family, but because they were already operating on mission timelines. Seconds mattered. The world outside this lawn hadn't paused for anyone's personal revelation. Behind me, nobody called my name. That surprised me. Not because I expected an apology. Because for the first time in years, my family genuinely didn't know what to say. What exactly do you say when the person you've underestimated your entire life turns out to be carrying responsibilities you can't even comprehend? There isn't a greeting card for that. I reached the aircraft. One of the operators stepped aside and gave me a respectful nod. Ma'am. Simple, professional, normal. Another operator held the boarding handle steady while reviewing information on a wrist-mounted display. Nobody here cared about family politics. Nobody cared about startup valuations. Nobody cared who got invited to country clubs. The only thing that mattered was whether everyone got home alive. I preferred that world, not because it was easier, because it was honest. As I placed a boot onto the boarding step, I glanced back one final time. The scene looked surreal. The expensive garden was destroyed. Several hedges were flattened. Patio furniture floated upside down in the pool. A luxury canopy had wrapped itself around a decorative statue. The photographer was still standing beside his equipment, looking like he had witnessed an alien invasion. and in the center of it all stood my family. Valerie looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence she carried all evening had vanished. For the first time, she wasn't managing appearances, she was confronting reality. My father stared at the helicopter with the expression of a man reviewing decades of bad assumptions. Gideon had always believed importance announced itself. Big titles, big offices, big salaries, big attention. Yet the most important thing that happened on his property that night involved the daughter he barely noticed. Life has a sense of humor. Then there was Trenton, the golden child, the entrepreneur, the star of the evening. He stood completely still, holding a phone that nobody cared about anymore. The investors weren't looking at him. The guests weren't listening to him. The spotlight he loved so much had disappeared. That's 'cause someone stole it, because reality walked into the room. I didn't feel satisfaction, that's the strange part. People assume moments like this feel victorious, like revenge, like winning. They don't. At least not for me. Standing there, looking at my family, I felt something quieter, understanding. For years I thought maybe if I worked harder, explained better, achieved more, or stayed patient longer, they would finally see me. But people only see what they're willing to see. No amount of evidence changes someone determined to believe their own story. The helicopter's engines increased power. The aircraft vibrated beneath my feet. Mission crews were waiting. Operators were counting on information. Lives were still hanging in the balance, and suddenly my family's opinion felt incredibly small. Not unimportant, just small, compared to everything else. General Caldwell climbed aboard and secured himself into a seat. I followed. The cabin door remained open for a few final seconds. Wind swept across the estate once more. Guests shielded their eyes. Loose debris scattered across the lawn. The operators boarded quickly, one by one, efficient, disciplined. Then the final crew chief stepped inside. The door began sliding closed. That was when I saw my mother move. Only a single step, as if she wanted to say something. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. Either way, the opportunity had passed. Not because I was angry, because life keeps moving. The door sealed shut. The outside world disappeared. Immediately, the cabin became quieter. Not silent, just focused, the way mission environments always felt. I secured the tablet and began reviewing updated routing options. The work came naturally, comfortably, like slipping back into my actual life. A minute later, the helicopter lifted off. The estate began shrinking beneath us. The ruined garden became a patch of green. The guests became tiny figures. The luxury cars became dots of reflected light. Everything looked smaller from above, including old grievances. I looked through the cabin window as the property disappeared into the distance. Surprisingly, I felt no anger, none. No resentment, no desire for revenge, no fantasy about what my family must be thinking. That chapter had already ended. What remained was peace. The kind that arrives when you stop trying to convince people of your value. The kind that arrives when you finally understand that dignity doesn't require permission. Years earlier, I thought respect came from being recognized. Experience taught me something different. Real respect isn't demanded across a dinner table. It isn't won through arguments. It isn't measured by applause, it's earned quietly. Through responsibility, through consistency, through showing up when people need you. Most of the men and women I worked with would never become famous. Many would never be publicly recognized. Yet they carried burdens most people could never imagine. And they did it without asking for attention. That mattered. The estate disappeared completely as the aircraft accelerated into the night. The mission was waiting. The team was waiting. The world was still turning. I settled into my seat and focused on the screen in front of me. Because eventually, I learned the most valuable lesson of all. You don't have to shout your worth to people determined to misunderstand you. Sooner or later, the truth finds its own way of landing right on their front lawn. The strangest part about that night wasn't the helicopter. It wasn't General Caldwell. It wasn't watching my family's faces when the truth finally arrived. The strangest part was realizing that none of it actually changed who I was. I was the same person before the helicopter landed. I was the same person after it left. The only thing that changed was what other people knew. For a long time, I didn't understand that difference. If you're anything like I used to be, you probably understand what I'm talking about. When you're constantly underestimated, ignored, or dismissed, it's easy to start believing that one day you'll finally earn the respect you've been denied. You tell yourself that if you work harder, achieve more, become more successful, or prove yourself often enough, the people who overlooked you will eventually see your value. I believed that for years, not consciously, not every day, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I carried that hope. I thought maybe my parents would eventually recognize what I was doing. Maybe my brother would stop treating me like the family disappointment. Maybe one achievement would finally be enough. Then another, then another. I earned promotions, completed difficult assignments, took on responsibilities most people would never want. I spent years carrying pressure that never appeared on a resume, and none of it changed how my family saw me. That realization used to hurt. Now it feels freeing. Because eventually I learned something important. Many people don't evaluate you based on who you are. They evaluate you based on the story they've already created about you. Once that story settles into place, every new piece of information gets filtered through it. If they believe you're irresponsible, your successes become luck. If they believe you're weak, your strength becomes an exception. If they believe you're ordinary, even extraordinary accomplishments get minimized. My family wasn't actually seeing me. They were seeing a character they had invented years earlier. The quiet daughter, the boring daughter, the desk clerk, everything else got ignored. And honestly, this isn't just a family problem. It happens everywhere, at work, in friendships, in relationships. People often decide who you are long before they know enough to make that decision. The mistake many of us make is spending years trying to change their minds. I know because I did it, not through arguments, not through complaints, through performance. I thought if I achieved enough, the recognition would follow. But chasing approval is like running on a treadmill. You burn energy, you move constantly, you never actually arrive. One of the biggest lessons from my story is that approval and love are not the same thing. A lot of people confuse them. I certainly did. When someone withholds approval, we instinctively work harder to earn it. We become more helpful, more accommodating, more patient, more willing to sacrifice ourselves. We convince ourselves that if we can just meet the right standard, everything will finally improve. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't. Because the problem was never your performance. The problem was their perception. And perception is something you don't control. That's a difficult truth. But it's also an incredibly powerful one. The moment you stop trying to manage other people's opinions, you get your life back. You stop making decisions based on how they'll react. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's approval. You stop turning every achievement into a request for validation. You simply become responsible for being who you are. Nothing more, nothing less. Looking back now, I realized something else. The helicopter didn't prove my value, it revealed it. There's a huge difference. If my worth only existed because a military aircraft landed in my parents' garden, then my worth would depend on external events. It would depend on recognition, attention, status. That's a dangerous way to live. The truth is that my value existed when I was standing alone near the edge of that patio. It existed when people laughed. It existed when my mother dismissed me. It existed when nobody understood what I did. Recognition didn't create value. Recognition simply exposed what was already there. That's why I want anyone listening to this story to be careful about where you place your self-worth. If your confidence depends on applause, you'll always need more applause. If your confidence depends on recognition, you'll always need more recognition. If your confidence depends on someone finally understanding you, you'll spend your life waiting. Build your life on something stronger. Your character, your integrity, your responsibilities. The promises you keep when nobody is watching. Those things remain valuable whether anyone notices them or not. And that's what finally brought me peace. Not proving people wrong, not embarrassing my family, not watching their assumptions collapse. Peace came from understanding that I never needed their permission to matter. I never needed their approval to have value, and neither do you. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this. Don't waste years trying to convince people to see what they have already decided to ignore. Spend that time becoming the person you were meant to be instead. Because the people who truly matter won't need to be convinced. And the people who refuse to see you probably never will. One of the things that stayed with me long after that night wasn't the look on my family's faces. It was something much simpler. It was the difference between attention and respect. Most people spend years chasing one while believing they're chasing the other. I know because I watched it happen my entire life. My brother loved attention. He wasn't alone. A lot of people do. Attention feels good. People listen when you walk into a room. They laugh at your jokes. They ask for your opinion. They remember your name. There is nothing wrong with enjoying that. The problem comes when we mistake attention for respect. Because they're not the same thing. Not even close. At my parents' party, Trenton had everyone's attention. The investors surrounded him. The guests applauded him. People waited for him to speak. They wanted access to him because they believed he could help them. That's attention. But when the helicopter landed and a real crisis entered the picture, something interesting happened. Attention shifted immediately. Not because anyone announced it, because reality changed. The room suddenly stopped caring about who was impressive. It started caring about who was useful. That distinction matters. A lot. During my career, I've worked alongside people whose names you'll never hear. Some couldn't care less about being recognized. Some avoided attention whenever possible. Yet they earned more respect from me than many famous people ever could. One was a communications specialist who spent 14 hours rebuilding a damaged relay network during a deployment overseas. Nobody gave him an award. Nobody interviewed him. Nobody posted about him on social media. But because he did his job well, dozens of people made it home safely. Another was a flight medic who stayed calm while treating multiple casualties during an evacuation. No cameras, no audience, no applause, just responsibility. That's respect. I've learned that the people who deserve admiration are often the least interested in receiving it. They're too busy carrying the weight nobody else wants. That's why I sometimes smile when people talk about success as if it's measured only by money or status. Money matters, success matters, achievement matters, but they don't automatically create character. And character is what people depend on when things go wrong. Think about your own life for a moment. If your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, who do you call? If your family faces a crisis, who do you trust? If you're going through the worst week of your life, whose voice do you want to hear? The answer is probably not the loudest person you know. It's probably the most reliable one, the person who shows up, the person who keeps their word, the person who doesn't disappear when things become difficult. That's respect. And here's something I've noticed. Society often rewards visibility, but life rewards reliability. Those aren't always the same people. At my parents' party, people looked at my brother and saw success. They looked at me and saw someone ordinary. Why? Because they were judging value through visible signals. His company, his suit, his investors, his speeches. Those things are easy to see. Responsibility isn't, integrity isn't, dependability isn't. You usually don't notice those qualities until you need them. Then they suddenly become the most important things in the room. I think that's one reason so many people misjudge others. We evaluate people using information that's easy to collect. Job titles, income, cars, houses, followers, degrees. Meanwhile, the qualities that actually determine who someone is often remain hidden. How do they treat people when nobody is watching? Do they keep their promises? Can they be trusted? Do they accept responsibility when things go wrong? Will they help others when helping becomes inconvenient? Those questions tell you far more than a resume ever will. If I could give one practical piece of advice, it would be this: be careful who you admire. A lot of people look successful from a distance. That doesn't mean they're worthy of your respect. Likewise, be careful who you dismiss. The quiet person in the corner may be carrying responsibilities you can't even imagine. The person with the ordinary job title may be extraordinary in ways that never appear on paper. The person nobody notices may be holding entire systems together. I learned that lesson from both sides. I know what it feels like to be underestimated. I also know how easy it is to underestimate others. That's why I try to ask better questions now. Not how important are they, but who are they when things become difficult? That answer tells me almost everything I need to know. Because in the end, the people who earn real respect are rarely the ones demanding it. They're the ones quietly proving, day after day, that others can depend on them. And if you're building your own life right now, focus on becoming one of those people. Attention comes and goes. Recognition comes and goes. Reputation rises and falls. But trust? Trust is one of the few things that keeps its value no matter what room you're standing in. And in my experience, the most respected person in the room is usually not the one doing the most talking. It's the one everyone hopes will be there when things fall apart. The story could have ended when the helicopter disappeared into the night. For a lot of people, that's where the satisfying part is. The reveal, the shock. The moment everyone finally realizes they were wrong. But if that's all you take away from this story, I think you'd miss the most important lesson. Because the helicopter wasn't the point. The point was everything that happened before it arrived. The assumptions, the judgments, the years of misunderstanding, and what those things taught me about life. If you've listened this far, I want to talk to you directly for a few minutes, not as a military coordinator, not as the woman from the story, just as someone who learned some difficult lessons the hard way. The first lesson is simple. Never hand someone else the authority to define your value. That sounds obvious. It isn't. People do it every day. They let parents define them, bosses define them, partners define them, friends define them, strangers on the internet define them. Eventually, they become trapped inside other people's opinions. I know because I spent years living that way. Part of me believed that if my family finally respected me, I would feel complete. What I eventually discovered was that self-respect has to come first. Otherwise, you're building your identity on a foundation you don't control. And anything you don't control can be taken away. The second lesson is just as important. Be extremely careful when judging other people. You never know what someone is carrying. One reason my story resonates with so many people is because almost everyone has experienced being underestimated. Maybe not by family, maybe not publicly, but somewhere. At work, at school, in a relationship. People looked at them and made assumptions. Sometimes those assumptions were completely wrong. That's why I've learned to slow down before deciding who someone is. The quiet coworker might be supporting an entire family. The person driving an old car might have more financial discipline than everyone around them. The employee nobody notices may be the reason the organization functions at all. The person sitting silently in the corner may be carrying responsibilities you couldn't imagine. Humility starts when we accept that we don't know everyone's story. And life gets a lot better when we remember that. The third lesson may be the hardest. You cannot force people to see you clearly. You just can't. Trust me, I tried. Many of us believe that if we explain ourselves one more time, work harder one more year, sacrifice a little more, or stay patient a little longer, eventually the people who misunderstand us will change. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. One of the most mature decisions you'll ever make is recognizing the difference. There are relationships worth repairing. There are people worth fighting for. There are misunderstandings worth addressing. But there are also situations where you've already done everything reasonable. At some point, continuing to chase approval becomes self-abandonment. And that's a price too high to pay. I want to be very careful here. This doesn't mean becoming bitter. It doesn't mean cutting everyone out of your life. It doesn't mean acting superior. It means accepting reality. Accepting that your responsibility is to live honestly, not to manage everyone's opinion of you. That distinction changed my life. The night at the Kensington estate gave my family new information. What they chose to do with that information was up to them, not me. And honestly, that's true for all of us. You are responsible for your actions, your character, your integrity, your choices. You are not responsible for controlling how every person interprets them. That realization creates freedom. Real freedom. The kind that allows you to stop performing and start living. When I think back to that helicopter lifting off from the lawn, I don't remember the embarrassment. I don't remember the destroyed garden. I don't remember the shocked investors. What I remember is the feeling of leaving behind a burden I had carried for far too long. The burden of needing to be understood. The burden of needing approval. The burden of hoping that one more accomplishment would finally be enough. It was never about accomplishments. It was about acceptance. And acceptance starts with yourself. So if you're listening to this today and you're feeling overlooked, underestimated, or misunderstood, I want you to remember something. Your value does not decrease because someone fails to recognize it. Your worth does not disappear because someone refuses to see it. And your future should never be limited by another person's opinion of you. Keep doing the work. Keep building your character. Keep becoming the person you want to be. Not because it will impress somebody, because it's the right thing to do. Thank you for spending this time with me and following this story all the way to the end. If this message meant something to you, if you've ever felt underestimated, or if you've learned something valuable from Blythe's journey, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We share new stories every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET, stories about resilience, dignity, courage, and the lessons that help us navigate real life. Until the next story, take care of yourself, trust your own worth, and never let someone else's limited view determine how far you can go.